Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to talk about how to properly integrate a subwoofer. Now there are a lot of different ways to do this and I'm not going to go over all of them. I'm only going to tell you about the way I do it. There's no right way, there's only the way you like to do it. You could use a calibrated mic and room EQ wizard. You can use your processor's built-in functionality if you have that, or you can choose to do it by ear like I do. You can use the subwoofer crawl method, you can use a decibel meter, you have all kinds of options. But what I like to do is, and this is of course, I'm assuming you've already chosen your subwoofer. First thing is where you're going to put it in your room, right? There's two kinds of people here. There's person one, where you only have limited options of where you could put it in your room, and you're most likely going to put it where it's going to look best, where your wife's not going to get upset, or where the kids aren't going to mess with it, and so on. If you're that person, that's where it goes. Whether it sounds the best there or not is inconsequential. That's where it's going. For everyone else, I would recommend starting in the corners. That's where you can see I have mine if you're using duals, or if you're using a single subwoofer, I would say 1/3 into the room on the main wall is generally a good place to start. You could do the subwoofer crawl method. I don't recommend it honestly, because like if you have like leather furniture, for example, it's just not a good idea to put like a 50, 60, 70 pound subwoofer on your leather couch or chair. Yeah, I wouldn't do that and then crawl around your room like a dog. I mean, if you can do that, more power to you. That's not me, I'm not doing that. So yeah, once you have your subwoofer set up where it's gonna go, whether it be by limited options or you're just listening to me and you're going for a corner or 1/3 into the room, cool. First thing we're gonna adjust is phase. Phase is really important. If you're out of phase, it will never ever sound good. And hopefully your room doesn't have some like phase issues. Some people are kind of screwed and just have phase issues no matter what. I'm one of them to a small degree, but it could be worse, so I'm not complaining. But what you're gonna do is set your frequency to something like high, like 60, 70 hertz, even 80 hertz. Set your volume knob on the subwoofer loud enough that it's obviously playing. And then pick phase between 0 or 180, whether you just have those two options or an infinitely variable switch. Go back and forth between 0 and 180. Just fuck everything in the middle for now. We'll come to that later. Start with 0 first is what I recommend. Go to your listening position, play some songs you're like intimately familiar with, and what you want to listen for is either cancellation where like mid bass is missing, or like just bass coming in crazy out of nowhere. Those two things are a good indicator that you're out of phase. So if it does that, go back, switch it to 180, go back to your listening position, listen again. Mid bass should be there, low bass should be there as well, but you should never have a situation where bass just comes out of nowhere. And awesome, the random image on the screen just changed. What's it doing now? Screensaver? All good, we're gonna keep going, I don't care. That's only up so my room doesn't have reflections off the TV. Anyway, so once you have your phase set up, if you do have variable phase adjustments, you can continue to like get up and play with it and see where it's perfect. But I'm really gonna go ahead and recommend you use a calibrated mic and something like Room EQ Wizard to find like your perfect phase if you do have like infinitely adjustable phase. If it's just 0 or 180 though, it's fairly easy. I'll be honest, even though I have like infinitely adjustable on the Rythmiks, I just use 180, that's what's right in my room. So once phase is set up, we're gonna move on to volume and frequency. Volume is also the same as gain, so if your subwoofer says gain on the back, that's volume also. Well, volume is technically gain, but who cares? So volume and frequency we're gonna kind of play with together at the same time to find the ideal sound. So we have our phase set up, our subwoofer is where it's gonna be, it's where it's gonna stay. You're gonna play some songs you're very familiar with, and you wanna start with your frequency set to around the same -3 dB point of your main speakers. And you're gonna set your volume to kind of where you're gonna just kind of guess, honestly, where it's like enough bass. Most people are gonna have their gain set way too high initially, and after playing a few tracks they're familiar with, you're gonna go back and kind of constantly turn it down as you realize your bass is turned up way too much. Most people that I've talked to usually get the gain set up right next. So let's talk about frequency now. If when you're listening to a track you're familiar with and there's a bass guitar in it, ideally, and here's a good example, the song is called I'm Gonna Be by the Proclaimers. If you're my age, 37 years old or older, you know that song, great song. The bass guitar, when it's strummed in the beginning and throughout the song, it actually extends very deep and is very plentiful, and it's like mixed in really, really good. You should not be able to tell when your subwoofer takes over on that bass strum at all. It should just sound like a continuous strum all coming from the same source. If it doesn't, like whereas maybe like the mid bass portion is like more in your face than the depth is of the strum, your frequency might be turned up too much. If the bass sounds thin, perhaps you have it turned down too much, right? So you got to play with it. A lot of this is going to be trial and error, especially if you're doing it by ear. I'll be honest, even if you're using a calibrated mic and room EQ wizard, you're still going to have to get up a bunch of times to make all these minute adjustments. So there's kind of no way of going around that. The only way I know to set up a subwoofer just like that is if you're using a subwoofer that has auto calibration, but even still, auto calibration gets you like halfway there and you still need to fine tune a little bit. So that's what I do. That's how I get it set up. There's a few songs I play. I play the intro to Young Jeezy Put On to make sure I've got that like infrasonic bass. I also use Young Jeezy Put On to make sure I don't have any cancellation issues because there's a few different frequencies. I'm going to be by the Proclaimers to check its integration and make sure frequency and volume are perfect because of that bass drum. It's just so good. I use another song by, I think it's called Efixa, Outside the Box, because it has this really hard, aggressive like tone to it on the bass line. And it starts out like with mid bass and drops down. And it's really easy to tell if you have good integration there. I also use Cherish by Madonna to make sure the volume isn't turned up too high. The intro of that song does have a good amount of bass, but it shouldn't like punch. It should almost be a little dry in the intro and then punch later in the song. I know that because I'm intimately familiar with that song. This might not work for you. You might need your own songs that you're intimately familiar with. I'm just telling you what I do. So at the end of the day, it's mostly going to be a trial and error process. I can't tell you exactly what frequency, what volume, what phase is going to be right for your room and your associated equipment. Even if we have the same subwoofer and the same size room, I can't do that because guess what? The amp you connect it to is also different. My preamp happens to kick out quite a bit of voltage on the RCAs. I found that out because I was helping my friend set up his subwoofer and he was having to crank his REL T5i way more than I had to in a similar sized room. And we found out it's because my preamp has way more voltage on the RCAs than his does. Anyhow, I digress. I think you get my point. I wish I could be more helpful with this, but at the end of the day, it really is just going to be a trial and error scenario where you're going to have to get up out of your chair a bunch of times to find the right adjustments. And if you have one of those subwoofers that has a ton of options on it, fuck all of that shit. Play with that shit another day. If you've got a PEQ or like just anything else, like I don't fuck with those options, honestly. I've kind of learned they kind of make things worse, and I definitely wouldn't mess with those things by ear. I would only use REL to mess with those options because those are going to be more to fix room issues and such. And anytime I've played with them, I haven't been happy with the result, honestly. You know, it just is what it is. So if you want to mess with them, go for it. I will tell you this, if it's taking longer than about like 20 minutes or so, or 30 minutes, I'd consider getting like Room EQ Wizard and a UMIC one. It might be better to go that route because it really should only take about 30 minutes or less to get it really dialed in. That's about how long it's kind of always taken me. Some subwoofers will dial in just a little bit easier, like the Rythmik L12. Honestly, it was like 5 minutes for some reason in my room. And then the Emotiva SE12 took like an hour, honestly. And that was really frustrating, but I wasn't using its built-in crossover. Anyhow, I've told you about as much as I can about integrating subwoofers as far as the way I do it. I'm sure there's other YouTubers that could tell you how to do it with a dB meter, or using REL, or using the subwoofer crawl method, and so on. That's just not me. I can only tell you the way I do it. If you have any questions, let's rap about it in the comments below. And until next time, later.